Hello, my name is May Kwong. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Connected Health Policy, the National Telehealth Policy Resource Center. For today's video, which is filmed on February 6, 2024, I'll be giving you an update on U.S. telehealth policy for the year 2024. Please keep in mind that this is policy through today's date. Again, it's February 6, 2024. And as we go through the slide deck, you will know that policy can actually change very rapidly here in the United States in relation to telehealth. So if you are viewing this at a later date, keep in mind that there may have been changes to information that I am saying today in this particular video. Before we get started, a few disclaimers. Know that any information provided today is strictly for informational purposes. It is not legal advice. CCHP always recommends that if you are interested in a formal legal opinion, that you consult with legal counsel. Also, if I happen to mention a name of a company or show a picture of a product, know that neither I nor CCHP has any type of relationship or arrangement with such a company. A bit of background about CCHP. We were established in 2009 as a program underneath the Public Health Institute to be a California telehealth policy organization. An opportunity to become the federally designated National Telehealth Policy Resource Center became available in 2012 through funding from HRSA. CCHP applied for that and we received that funding, and we've been serving in that capacity ever since. We also work with a variety of funders and partners on the state and federal level on more specific projects related to telehealth or connected health. CCHP also acts as the administrator of the National Consortium Telehealth Resource Center, which is a collaboration of the 14 telehealth resource centers who are underneath the same funding program as CCHP. There are 12 regional resource centers that cover specific states in the United States, and then there's another national center that covers technology. CCHP is the one on policy. Several years ago, we decided to pull a bit of our resources together to work on collaborative projects that can span either the nation or multiple regions, and CCHP administers that work for that group. We are also the convener for the California Telehealth Policy Coalition, which is a coalition of over 175 statewide and national organizations and individuals who are interested in advancing telehealth policy in the state of California. So today's webinar, we're going to provide an overview of the state and federal telehealth policy landscape. We're going to talk about current status of certain policies. As some of you may be aware, as of the beginning of 2024, there are some policies that are only around temporarily as far as we know at this moment. So we'll talk about what their current status is and what maybe their future might be. We'll talk about policy issues that should be monitored and what could possibly happen this year. And I want to also mention that if you are interested in a specific billing answer, that's not what this webinar will provide. I'm just providing an overview, a landscape view of the telehealth policy. If you have specific billing questions, I recommend that you contact CCHP directly, or if it's about a particular state, also contact your regional telehealth resource center. They are also very well informed around reimbursement policy as well. But you can also reach out to CCHP if we need to refer you to the regional telehealth resource center that you are located in. We'll be happy to do that as well too. So talking about federal and state policy, you have to understand that it is really two separate types of tracks of policy. And there are certain issues that belong exclusively in federal jurisdiction and some that belong in state jurisdiction. And these are the subjects that we're going to cover today. There are many policy issues that can impact the use of telehealth, both on the federal and the state level. I can't go into all of them on today's video, but we'll go over some of like the larger issues that are looming here, and also the ones that, have some unanswered questions around them right now as far as what their status may be. So for the federal policy, we'll cover Medicare and CMS. We'll talk about prescribing and controlled substances, HIPAA privacy and data, and also licensure. For state policy, we'll talk about Medicaid, private payer, prescribing, and licensure. And as you can see, there's a little bit of overlap here on some of the policy issues, particularly around prescribing and licensure. And during the presentation, I'll make the distinction on how that's different or maybe not different and how they may impact each other or overlap against each other. So to understand telehealth policy, there are really four major components that sort of build your policy around telehealth, and really policy any type of subject related to like any type of issue. There are laws that impact it and regulations. There's also guidances, and what those are they could be a variety, take the form of a variety of things. They could be memos or guide. They actually call them guidances, or policy memos or letters to providers. And these are really things that are issued by the regulatory agencies overseeing something. So, for example, it could be like a CMS provider manual. So, that's going to impact Medicare because they administer the Medicare program. Or if you're in Medicaid, they may be sending out a provider letter or provider bulletin to their Medicaid providers that are enrolled with the program. Those don't have the impact of like being a law or a regulation, but they do like tell you like how that agency is administering something related to that particular policy. So you do have to pay attention to those as well. Then there are also the fourth category, court cases. And this is the one that I think maybe a lot of people may not be aware of, or it's like sort of on the periphery of their attention, but court cases can also develop policy or impact policy significantly. For example, if like a court case found that a policy was in violation of a law somewhere, and then it's like struck down. So that's also another area to pay attention to, and we'll also talk about it in today's video as well. So we're going to start off with the federal level. We're going to start off with CMS and Medicare, and this is really about reimbursement and coverage. So for those who may not be aware, if you're talking about federal telehealth policy, a lot of the established or existing telehealth specific policy that specifically says it's about telehealth, is really in CMS and Medicare. There are other policies on the federal level that do involve telehealth, but they may not be specific to telehealth. They may have impacts on telehealth, but they may not call out telehealth specifically, such as, for example, HIPAA. But CMS has very specific telehealth policies, and there's also laws associated with them. Again, very specific to telehealth as well, too. And those laws dictate to CMS what they're supposed to do for the most part around telehealth in that program, in the Medicare program. So the Medicare telehealth policy evolution, this is sort of just high level how it's changed over the last couple of years. Before you had COVID-19, the Medicare policy around telehealth was fairly limited. It was very restrictive. There were limitations on where it could take place, who could be providing the services, and what services were being provided that would be covered by Medicare. And this is really because a lot of this was policy that was passed a while ago, but it's policy that's embedded in federal law. So you have restrictions such as a geographic restriction saying that telehealth, the patient needed to be located in a certain geographic location, a certain type of geographic location, if telehealth is being used, if Medicare was going to cover that service. There were also a specific list of services that Medicare would cover, and also a specific list of providers who are eligible to provide those services. So fairly limited, fairly narrow. Then you had COVID-19 hit, and the realization, especially since people were, asked to try to like limit contact with each other while this very infectious virus is going around. So there was a need then to use some type of or deliver services in some type of way where you were minimizing like in-person contact, and telehealth was a natural fit for that. However, because of the restrictive policies that existed, Congress and CMS needed to basically institute temporary waivers to remove those restrictions to allow greater utilization of telehealth during the pandemic. And that's where we are now. Even though the public health emergency ended in May of last year, those temporary waivers are the question of like, what's happening with them. And for the most part, the big, most impactful waivers are still around. So these were the waivers that temporarily suspended those restrictions that were in federal law. And it's been decided that they will stick around at least until the end of the year. Now, I'm only going to go over a couple of these. There are a lot of other waivers that are still in existence and in place, and some that have expired as well. I think overall, there were at least about 70 policy waivers on the federal level related to telehealth during the pandemic. There may have been more, but there were definitely around 70, at least where CMS was concerned, and a couple other federal programs. Some of them have already expired. Some of them have been made permanent, and some of them are in this temporary like grace period until the end of 2024. And among them are some of the major ones, such as I mentioned earlier, the geographic requirement, expanding the list of eligible providers who can provide the services via telehealth in the Medicare program get reimbursed, such as federally qualified health centers and rural health clinics, and allowing the home to be an eligible site for all the services that are eligible. The non-waiver landscape of policy related to like the home allows certain services, a small narrow band of services to take place in the home. But the temporary waiver allows like all eligible services to be eligible to be in the home. And also allowing some services to be provided via audio only. And this is one of the more significant policy developments we've seen because of the pandemic, because beforehand, audio only was extremely, extremely limited or non-existent. Definitely in Medicare, it wasn't underneath the telehealth umbrella to allow it. It was underneath, there were a few things underneath something else, but when you're talking about delivering services and it being considered telehealth, it wasn't allowed underneath CMS and Medicare before COVID-19. And the same could be said for essentially the Medicaid programs and, you know, the rest of the country. Audio only was not considered a part of telehealth for in most places, in practically all places. And there were only very limited things that you can do with audio only that would get reimbursed. So that was definitely a shift. And also it's something that is on that temporary allowance until the end of this year, that certain services can continue to be provided via audio only. So these are some of the major things that are still around, at least through this year. Some of the more hyper-specific things that are still around is allowing the provider to use their business address rather than their home address. This was a concern that since you have to let CMS know where you were as a provider when the telehealth service took place, just so they can figure out the rates and everything. If providers were at home providing that services, they had to put their home address, but those claims can sometimes be accessible by the public. So there was the concern by providers of like, well, I don't want my home address out there for the general public to see, or anybody to see, because, you know, for whatever reason. And I think we may all be a little hesitant about that. So there was a waiver during COVID-19 where CMS said, okay, you don't have to do that. You can go ahead and put your business address, like where your clinic is when you're doing this, if even if you happen to be on that particular time for that telehealth interaction doing it from home. So they're continuing to allow that at least through the end of this year. And also there was a frequency limitation on skilled nursing facilities. The permanent policy is like once every 14 days. CMS has said that, you know, we're going to suspend that for temporarily until the end of this year. So those are a couple of things, like some of the major things and some of the more specific policies that are sticking around through 2024. However, the question is that, you know, what happens next then? And that is really something that Congress is thinking about. They've held several hearings over like the last couple of months on like, you know, where do we go from here regarding this? There's got to be some action because there is a definite deadline right now. What that action is, nobody quite knows. There is some interest in at least keeping some of these things around, but you know, we're not quite sure where they'll eventually land on it. So people always ask me, like, you know, what is the possibility we'll get a telehealth bill and that's where we'll see these changes? And I say, this is just my opinion, not based on any inside knowledge or anything. I would say like a telehealth specific bill on the federal level is unlikely. What they've done historically is included major policy changes in a large bill. So such as an appropriation bill or a bill dealing with a different issue and there's a telehealth component to it, such as, you know, dealing with like substance use disorders or the opioid epidemic. COVID-19, a big bill on related to COVID, and you see telehealth policies in there. So I would expect it to be in a larger bill, most likely like an appropriations bill. It doesn't mean that it couldn't be a telehealth specific bill. I just think given their history, a larger bill is more likely. And that may actually be a little bit easier to get passed because then you're not hyper focused on like one thing like telehealth, but there's like a bunch of things in there that, a member would want to see pass, and they're willing to, let something that they're, not as enthused about get passed as well, because there's a bunch of other stuff in the bill that they really like. So that would be my guess. Again, I don't have any inside knowledge. What that looks like, nobody quite knows yet. Are we going to still have like this sort of like broad expanse that we have now? Probably not. There are like concerns on some of these policies, like, there's concern that FQHCs and RHCs can't be telehealth providers. There's concern that, some folks don't have access to broadband, and audio only is like their only way of like getting services. But then there's also concern of like, oh, but audio only, can be done for other services, other types of specialties beyond, let's say, mental health. So there's like a lot of questions that are swirling around. I have also heard some say that this year, instead of making a permanent decision, there may be another delay. So there may be like another extension. But we shall see. They are working on an appropriation bill for 2024. So it is possible to slip something in there related to this. So that is something current to keep your eye on, not only because of like the importance of having a budget for the federal government, but for a telehealth, through a telehealth lens, that is like a potential vehicle where a change may be put in place. This PowerPoint will be made available on our website as well too. So things are hyperlinked, and you probably see that on your screen. So a couple of resources that go into like a little bit more detail on like some of the other temporary waivers that you may want to like click on as well too, and like read up on. Prescribing and controlled substances. So again, the history of this, before COVID-19, there was in law a section where it detailed how you could use telehealth to prescribe a controlled substance without that telehealth provider having had an in-person exam of the patient that they were prescribing to. That was put into federal law underneath a bill called the Ryan-Haight Act. So for those of you who hear telehealth people say like, oh, Ryan-Haight, that's the controlled substance thing, that's why it's given that name, because that was the name of the act that like put it into federal law. In that law, there are certain exceptions on the use of telehealth to prescribe a controlled substance without an in-person visit, and they're very narrow. So there are things such as, oh, the patient is in a DEA licensed facility at the time of the telehealth interaction, or, oh, the patient is with a DEA registered physician at the time of the telehealth interaction. So very specific, very narrow. One of the exceptions is also when a public health emergency is declared. So this is, I think, a misconception that some people have, is that during COVID-19, Congress went in and made a change to allow telehealth to be used to prescribe a controlled substance without a prior in-person visit. And that's not what happened. This was already in federal law, and it just automatically kicked in once the public health emergency was declared. So Congress hasn't really acted on it in response to COVID, and I don't think they're actually going to act on it. So that means it's within the realm of the DEA, who administers this particular bit of policy, for them to decide what's going to happen next. So when the public health emergency was winding down last year, like in May of 2023, a couple of months before that, March 1st to be exact, of 2023, the DEA issued the regulations on this is what's going to happen after the public health emergency with telehealth and prescribing controlled substances. And their proposal was not met with a lot of happiness by the telehealth folks in the telehealth field. So basically what they had proposed was just another narrow exception. They were saying, and I call it the asynchronous or distort and forward exception. The exception was, well, we're going to create a new exception post PHE, where if a patient goes in and sees, let's say, their primary care provider, and that primary care provider collects all the information, conducts an exam, and then sends all that information to the telehealth provider, that's fine with us. That telehealth provider can go ahead and prescribe. So again, it's the same thing as if the patient, the exception of like, oh, well, the patient's there with a registered DEA provider during the time of the telehealth interaction. It's just the asynchronous version of it. And then they actually issued two proposed regulations. And then there was one that was specific to the prescribing of buprenorphine, that kind of like aligned with, that other sort of more general proposal. Plus, there were other things that they were proposing as well, too, such as, oh, we're going to require you, if you like did all this or first created like this relationship with these patients, telehealth providers, we're going to require you to have that in-person visit or meet one of the narrow exceptions, and you have to do that by like November. I think it was like November 11th, 2023. So they gave them like 6 months to like meet the other requirement in some way. And then there were a couple other things. As I said, it was not met with like a lot of positive response. So I think they had over 38,000 or close to 38,000 public comments. And when a federal agency does propose regs, they're supposed to get those public comments. They have to respond to each of those comments. So that meant they had to read each one and craft a response. They don't have to craft an individual response, because a lot of times people will be saying the same thing, so that they can say like, oh, a bunch of people said X and this is our response to it. But they do have to read all of the responses. So there was just no time for them to do that. They, like I said, they issued this on March 1st. They had to have at least a 30-day comment period. So things closed down on March 31st. And then that left only April, and then like less than 2 weeks in May, because the public health emergency ended May 11th, 2023. There was just no way for them to like read all those, respond, and then like publish that and then publish final regs. So what the DEA said was, okay, you know what? We need more time. So what we're going to do is we're going to extend what happened in COVID, the relaxed policy in COVID. We're going to extend it to November 11th, 2023. During that time, you can still operate like you did during COVID. But then after that, from November 11, 2023 to November 11, 2024, you can still prescribe via telehealth, but you have that year then to have that in-person visit with like somebody that you had in order to like fit into one of those narrow exceptions there. And, that should give you plenty of time. That still is not making folks happy. And also, I think there was a shift within the DEA because later in 2023, in September 2023, they held, public hearing sections or listening sessions. And, there were a lot of people providing their comments and their feedback on it. And then we saw in October, the DEA came out and said, you know what? Scratch everything we said previously. We are going to extend these COVID exceptions until the end of 2024. So now they're aligning their policies, or at least the deadline to their policies or the end of their policies, to what we saw in Medicare and CMS. So everything, those temporary waivers for CMS and Medicare, will end at the end of 2024. And now the DEA is saying the same with like our waivers, our allowances here for prescribing controlled substance via telehealth. So that's our magic date here of like something's got to happen before the end of 2024, both with CMS and Medicare and the prescribing controlled substance. Or if nothing happens, we do revert back for essentially, there were some changes in CMS, but essentially to like the very narrow pre-COVID world that we had around telehealth policy. You will see there's an orange box on the screen on the right hand on your screen, and it says January 31st, final rules on prescribing of buprenorphine for opioid treatment programs. Now, this was something else. This was something actually coming out of SAMHSA, where during the public health emergency, they said, you know what, we're going to give a little leeway to opioid treatment programs, and they can prescribe buprenorphine through live video, but also audio only if certain requirements are met. So SAMHSA and HHS did propose regs at the end of 2022, basically saying like, should we make this final? And they also allowed some limited availability of using audio only for methadone as well too, which was definitely very different because methadone is a sort of more restrictive, or they have more controls over methadone distribution, methadone and prescribing of methadone, because I think it's a level 2 and buprenorphine is level 3. So methadone, they've always been a little bit more careful about when talking about telehealth. But the final rules were issued on January 31st. They go into effect April 4th, I believe, in 2024. That says, and this is permanent policy now because these were final rules, you can use an opioid treatment program. And keep that in mind. This is like very narrow and restricted. This is different from what I just said earlier about the DEA. The DEA is just more, broad, more impacts more people. This is just for opioid treatment program. Certain conditions are met. They can prescribe via audio only, or live video buprenorphine. And then they can do a limited amount of things with live video, not only audio only, just live video when you're talking about methadone. So that is also another shift that we've seen as well. And also, I'm recording this on February 6th, as I mentioned earlier. CCHP also just issued a newsletter that goes into more detail about this final rule for opioid treatment programs. And I do want to stress, again, this is for opioid treatment programs. It is very different than the DEA and prescribing controlled substance via telehealth. It's much narrower. All right, HIPAA, privacy, and data. So before COVID-19, HIPAA existed, but there was nothing in HIPAA specific to telehealth. So there wasn't like a section that said, this is what you do for HIPAA if you're providing services via telehealth. So telehealth providers had to really, kind of adjust and figure out, okay, how do I meet my HIPAA requirements if I'm using telehealth? And they were able to do that. However, the pandemic, I think, made people realize like, wow, those HIPAA rules are actually really out of date and they don't take into consideration telehealth. A lot of other things also has happened in the last couple of years related to protection of patient information, about HIPAA, about tracking and data and everything, etc. So all of these things have like come to the forefront in the minds of federal regulators of it's kind of important that maybe we weigh in on this and maybe we change some things here. So what we're seeing is a desire to refresh and update HIPAA. There was an executive order on, looking at HIPAA regulations and keeping them up and sort of updating them with telehealth in mind. But we also saw some of these administrative agencies really start to issue things and more instructions to folks on, what happens with telehealth and HIPAA and what should you be aware of. And these are like that third sort of element of policy that I said, like, that helps shape telehealth policy. These are like the guidances. These are like the memos that I was talking about earlier that a overseeing agency releases, that it's important for people to pay attention to because it gives you an idea of like maybe how they're going to, police you or regulate you. So these are like some of the things that have come out from the different agencies that have been involved, like OCR. So definitely, check those out for more details. But also what's emerged over the last couple of years is concern over privacy and data as well, too. And yes, that's associated with HIPAA, but we're also seeing like other types of policies being developed because of concerns over these particular issues. And not all of this stemmed from telehealth. So some of this is stemmed from other things that are going on out there in the healthcare landscape, such as reproductive rights and issues, and like the data surrounding that and how do you protect that, tracking of people and like, what they're doing with their healthcare and so forth. So all of these things have resulted not quite in federal laws yet, maybe, but definitely, again, more of these guidances and like warnings and, you know, regulations by like federal agencies regarding these areas of, protecting health information and the data and the tracking. And I bring this up just for folks to be aware of this going on. You may think like, oh, this doesn't really direct like telehealth provision of care, but it directs like maybe it really impacts like the platform that you're using as well. So for example, there's like a lot of concern over tracking of the data or tracking of the movements of people related to like health apps or like maybe software that you're using or a platform that you're using. So the fact that the administering or oversight agencies keep issuing like these resources or these guidances or even warnings of like, hey, be aware of this stuff, tells me that they have a keen interest in these issues. So I want to bring that up for telehealth folks of Like, be aware. This is like going on out there. You may think it doesn't impact you, and it maybe doesn't impact you right now. It could impact you further down the road. So just be aware of this going on. Licensure. A lot of you may be aware that licensure, you're probably wondering, like, why is it here in the federal section? It's licensure is like dictated by the state. And yes, that's true. However, what happened at the end of 2023 was that somebody filed a court case in New Jersey. December 13th of 2023, it's McDonald v. New Jersey State Board of Medical Examiners that said, your licensure laws in relation to telehealth are illegal because they violate constitutional rights of people. So because it's a constitution, a U.S. Constitution argument, that makes it a federal case here. And they're basing their arguments on 4 parts of the Constitution: the Commerce Clause / dormant Commerce Clause, privilege and immunities, free speech, First Amendment, and 14th Amendment due process. And just very quickly, the Commerce Clause is basically interstate commerce is in the federal domain. So you can't interfere with it, or a state can't pass a law that interferes with it. The plaintiffs in this case are arguing, like, by requiring the licensure, you're interfering with like interstate commerce. That's against the Constitution because that's in Congress's purview to like handle. Privileges and immunities clause is there are certain privileges we all have based on the U.S. Constitution, and one of those is like the right to earn a living. To require the license, then you're actually interfering with that, violation of the Constitution. These are arguments that the plaintiffs are making. First Amendment, this one's really interesting. We're all aware that underneath the First Amendment, we have freedom of speech involved there. So basically that means like you can't police my speech. There are certain exceptions, for example, that could cause great harm or lying about something, those aren't going to be protected. But for the most part, we're allowed to converse with other people. And they're saying because a government entity would need to know what the conversation was between the patient and the provider in order for them to determine that there is a violation of licensure, you're regulating my free speech then. So that was an interesting argument to make, and that's one that they offered up. And then the 14th Amendment due process clause. Most of you are probably familiar or with due process in relation to like a criminal case, but due process also covers other things on the civil area as well. And one area is that parents can decide, about the education and healthcare of their children. Underneath this case, the McDonald v. New Jersey State Board of Medical Examiners, one of the plaintiff parties is actually the parent of a patient. And they're saying that by requiring like my doctor, who is a Pennsylvania doctor, and I'm a New Jersey resident, by requiring them to have like a New Jersey license, you're interfering with my choices, my health choices for my child. So that's a violation of the due process clause. So as I said, this is a fairly recent case. It was just filed in December, so end of last year. New Jersey, as far as I know, has not filed a response yet. They have until like the mid-February. I think they have like another 10 days. It's either the 15th or the 16th is their deadline to file a response. A lot can happen, but this is like very, very interesting in that it is taking on the licensure law related to telehealth head on here. There's been like a lot of like discussion and theory. CCHP has also been involved in some of this talk as well, of like, well, there may be a constitutional argument made that licensure laws might violate the U.S. Constitution. This is being tested now. This is being tested in a court case. However, the filing is only the first step. So there's still quite a ways to go. For one thing, the plaintiffs can like withdraw their case. That could happen as well. New Jersey can pass a law that, renders these arguments moot. And then the court can say like, throw out the case because you have no case. Or, let's say the plaintiffs win, most likely New Jersey would like appeal it then. So there, you can go through like an appeal process. So this is not something that is probably going to get resolved in then like the next, 3 or 4 months or something. It's going to be like probably a long road here, but it is like the first step, an interesting step that could impact medical licensure laws nationwide, because a lot of the licensure laws are very similar to what New Jersey has. I mean, a lot of them. So if this is declared unconstitutional, you can see this domino effect across the country then around medical licensure. So very interesting case, one to keep an eye on, but we are far from like, being able to predict what will happen because there's still a lot of like unknown factors and things that could happen between now and like whatever conclusion we come to. All right, now on to the state, Medicaid and private payers. And for the most part, unlike on the federal level, the majority of states, not all of them, but the majority of states already settled on like what their post-COVID policies are going to be. So you're not really seeing a lot of them having to make those major decisions that Congress is going to have to make about Medicare. They've already done that. There are a couple states that did do a delay and say like, well, we'll keep the temporary stuff until June of 2024 or something. But for the most part, most states have already decided what they were going to do. So where we stand now with the Medicaid programs and private payer laws is that like all states in DC reimburse for some live video in their Medicaid program. 33 states reimburse for store and forward. 37 states reimburse for some remote patient monitoring. The biggest change that we've seen in comparison to a pre-COVID landscape was the audio only one. As I mentioned earlier, if you had spoken to anybody in telehealth before COVID-19 and said like, is telephone or audio only a part of telehealth? They would have told you no. Now that is definitely changed. It's become like the second sort of, most popular modality that Medicaid programs reimbursing for. Now, again, it could be very limited. A lot of these states, they may say like, we allow audio only, but you know what? We're only allowing it for mental and behavioral health, or they put other conditions around it as well too. But it's definitely been a shift in policy over the last couple of years. And then for private payer laws, we haven't really seen a lot of movement on that. In the last couple of years, there have been changes to existing private payer laws, a lot of them also mainly to like add to the definition that audio only is considered underneath telehealth. But we haven't seen like a lot of new states like implement a private payer law because they didn't have one before. So overall, that's where we stand in the nation as far as like Medicaid and like what they're doing and in private payer laws. Prescribing. So we talked about prescribing in the DEA. That's controlled substances. Everything else that's not a controlled substance, it's up to the states for them to decide how they're going to handle it. And where telehealth, the policy is concerned, it's usually in establishing that patient-provider relationship is where you're going to see telehealth crop up, where they say like, oh, well, you can establish that through live video. And then prescribing goes from there. For the most part, the states say like, yeah, you can definitely do it through live video. There are a couple of states that allow it to do it asynchronously, use an asynchronous platform to form that relationship. Not a lot. It's basically you got to do it via live video. However, they too have limitations on prescribing, and it's usually around a specific type of area or for a condition or something around that. It's usually specific to something. So for example, there may be limitations on using telehealth to prescribe like an abortion-inducing drug. There's also limitations on using telehealth to prescribe like for vision and hearing implements, so like contact lenses or hearing aids, for marijuana as well too. And also you'll see like a lot of states have like some language or some verbiage in their policy of saying like, oh, around controlled substances, we follow what's allowed by like federal law. So this is where things stand on prescribing, and where I would say like it probably is landing now, or like what we can expect in 2024 is there's probably going to be some more hyper specific limitations on prescribing like we're seeing there. I don't know if anything else is going to crop up. I have not seen it really anything like different as far as outside of the ones that I have listed here, but doesn't mean it can't happen. Like, for example, hearing really started coming out maybe a year or two ago. Like we started seeing things being passed to like limit using telehealth when prescribing a hearing aid. So it's not to say that, there can't be like another bullet underneath there, like next year of like, oh, now they're doing limitations around apps. But that's definitely something to keep a watch out for. A licensure, New Jersey case aside, Licensure, it basically states say, for the most part, states say like you need to have a license in our state if you're going to treat a patient within our borders. Their workaround around that has been historically through compacts. So a state will join a licensure compact, and depending on how that compact is structured, it could be you have one license, you can practice in multiple compact states, or it could mean you have a license from a compact member state and you're allowed to go through an expedited process to get a license in another compact member state. So it really changes or really varies depending on like what compact you're talking about. And the compacts are usually structured around professions. So you have one for doctors, you have one for nurses, one for OTs, one for PTs, etc. And we're starting to see them become like different ones being created. I think the latest one is for dietitians. We're starting to see legislation introduced to join a dietitian licensure compact. So that's been kind of like the most popular way to address the licensure issue on the state level. But what we're also starting to see over the last couple of years are other routes that states may be taking, including registries, which is you get on the registry, you're considered a good egg, you don't need to get a license, you can go ahead and practice in X state. But we're seeing more and more specific limited exceptions that states are putting in place, such as, well, we'll make an exception for you getting a license if you have a prior established patient relationship. But they usually limit those, saying like, well, you can like continue to practice or provide services to a patient that's within our state borders, but only for like, say, 30 days or something like that. And that's usually because they're trying to account for like somebody moved to our state, they're still seeing like their old doctor, give them time to find a new doctor, etc. Or if there's infrequent interactions, and that's mainly because they moved to our state temporarily, such as a student, maybe attending college. So we want them to still be able to see their doctor, but we know they're not a permanent resident, that type of thing. Or they may have exceptions for like a contiguous state exception, such as, well, they're within 50 miles of the border and they're getting those services. So yeah, they're getting those services from a provider that's across the border. So we'll allow that as well too. So we're starting to see more and more of those crop up in the States. And we'll probably continue to see more of those, especially the prior relationship that's been established. I think policymakers, most of them say like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And really kind of what spurred that a lot are those college students, because during the pandemic, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I got so many calls where they were saying, from policymakers saying like, hey, I got a call from my constituent, or hey, I know someone whose kid came up from college and they can't access student health anymore. And they had set up a relationship with some provider. And because the provider saying they're not licensed in that kid's state. And it's like, well, yeah, that's the policy. So that I think helped shift it for a lot of policymakers in that, well, maybe we should make this exception that they've had this relationship established. And we should allow at least, a little bit of time for them to either find a new one, or we know that they're not seeing them like, so frequently. It's like, once a month or something like that. So that's what is going on the state level with licensure, which again, depending on how the New Jersey case goes, maybe having a different conversation later on. So what to look out for in 2024? The big thing on the federal level, those temporary policies. It's like, what's happening with them? A lot of this is like coming to a head or will end on the end of like 2024. Where do we stand on this? Medicare, the CMS stuff, again, I say look to a big bill. The next big bill is probably going to be the appropriation bill, so keep an eye on that. And those bills are big, so they're like hundreds and hundreds of pages. So you've really got to like comb through it to see if there's any telehealth stuff in there. The prescribing controlled substances, that's on DEA for them to issue regulations. And people have asked me like, well, when are they going to come out with it? I don't know. My guess would be like, I would think they would need to do that fairly soon in order to avoid what happened last year where they didn't have enough time to respond to comments. So that's why I kind of think like, maybe in this first or second quarter, just to give themselves enough time if they're going to stick with that end date of December 31st, 2024. And that's the other thing. It is highly possible that we get another extension, that they punt it to make a decision later on. So we could see that happening both for the Medicare stuff and the DEA stuff as well too. But something needs to happen unless they're willing just to let everything lapse, and then we just go back to like, our very restrictive policies. Look for a HIPAA update due this year. Heard that maybe around June, around the summer, we're going to see something. I don't know if it's going to be like guidance or like, proposals, rules proposals, but supposedly something's going to come out as a HIPAA update. AI, you've all probably been familiar with all the comments about AI. The thing is with AI, it is really an unknown area right now as far as like, what policy around it. That's what policymakers are trying to figure out. It's like, how do we regulate this? What do we need to regulate? So they're still working through that, both on the state and federal level. And that's where you're going to have to like really monitor it, because some states are moving a little bit faster than how the feds are, which is not a surprise. We've seen that historically with like other issues as well too. So what could be done may be done on the state level, and then that becomes a trend that other states pick up on, and maybe even the federal government. But if anything, this does feel like the AI issue of like building policy as we're flying the plane. So there's nothing set yet, but there is this urgency and this need to like do something. So it's something to keep an eye out for 2024. And then broadband, because telehealth doesn't work unless you have broadband and connectivity. And one of the sort of immediate need is the Affordable Connectivity Program, which those folks who aren't familiar with that's like a stipend given to folks to help them pay for their internet, for their broadband. That program is actually winding down because they're out of money, because we don't have a budget passed as, again, of this date in February in 2024. So they have to start their wind down process. However, I have heard that there's bipartisan support to continue to fund it, but until the budget's passed, that's kind of, they've got to start winding down because they don't have the money. The other thing for states, what to be aware of, for the most part, again, states have like settled on their policy, but they're really curious now. They really do want information on like, what's the efficacy? What's the usage of telehealth? How widespread is it? So at least for Medicaid programs, a lot of them are taking a hard look at that and trying to gather that data. So that's something to be aware of, what's going on the state level regarding telehealth and Medicaid. Some states also do have temporary extensions. Again, a lot of them have settled, but there are some states, Maryland and Connecticut come to mind, that temporarily extended their policy. So they're going to have to make a final decision soon as well, too. And then areas for further policy development discussion, definitely Medicaid and licensure prescribing should be up there as well too. But here's the rub with like states though. A lot of states are facing budget shortfalls. So when a state government or even the federal government, they're being very conservative as far as like, how much to spend and everything. But once a government faces a budget shortfall, they tend to shrink. So they tend to like not want to expand policies. And this can impact what happens with telehealth over the next year or so. It's because they're facing these shortfalls. They don't really want to expand it, because then that's more, in their eyes, that's more money going out. So we could see like on the state levels, especially if it's state that's facing a budget shortfall, again, be very narrow or conservative or not do anything around their telehealth policy this coming year. So that's also like an outside force that's going to impact telehealth policy as well too. That is it. That's sort of like a quick, well, not quick, because I think this has been kind of a long video, but that's like an overview of what is going on in 2024, at least as far as we know in February of 2024, what we can probably expect and what to keep an eye out on. I hope you come and visit our CCHP website. That is the best place to keep abreast of like any developments, that and our newsletter. So I would highly encourage you to subscribe to that. But other than that, I just thank you for listening to this video, and we will see you hopefully in another video, or I will see you at another conference. But to keep abreast of things, again, really the best way is probably subscribe to our newsletter and also to frequently check our website at cchpca.org. Thank you very much and have a great day.